UFC 320 truly delivered as one of the best pay-per-views of the year so far, and by the end of the year will probably go down as a top 5 pay-per-view for sure, maybe even top 3 in my opinion. And we already talked about the 2 championship fight recaps in the previous video. If you haven't seen it, be sure to go check that out on the channel. And now we have to jump into the rest of the card, and we start with the featured bout, which I already talked about in large part in that main event discussion regarding Alex Pereira's title-earning performance over Magomedov Ankalaev, but I am still going to give some brief thoughts here in this video as well. And that featured bout included Jiri Prochazka, the former champion, versus Khalil Rountree Jr., the former title challenger. And we saw these two men go to war for 12 minutes and 4 seconds prior to Jiri Prochazka getting the vicious knockout against Khalil Rountree Jr. at the 3 minute and 4 second mark of the third and final round. In a fight that Jiri was losing on the scorecards 2-0, and if that fight had gone 1 minute and 56 seconds longer, Khalil Rountree Jr. would have improved his win streak to 2 instead of Jiri improving his own to 2. And the 32-year-old Prohaska just secured his 32nd win of his career and the 28th knockout out of those 32. That is an absolutely mind-boggling stat. And I will say that Khalil Rountree Jr. looked damn good in the first 2 rounds of this fight. He was picking apart Jiri on the feet, landing very clean shots and very powerful shots as well. But Jiri's wacky, wild, awkward fight style just proved to be too much for Khalil, paired with the absolute pressure and pace that Jiri was putting on. He was essentially pulling off a Merab Dvalishvili, but with the striking instead of the grappling. He did not stop pressing forward, even after eating shot after shot from Khalil, and that would ultimately lead to Jiri pulling away in that third round, ripping to the body of an already tired Khalil and further tiring him out, leading to that vicious one-punch knockout at the little over halfway mark of the final round. Jiri Prochazka has had 8 fights in the UFC since debuting in July of 2020, and none of them have gone to the scorecards, and that includes his 3-round bouts and his 5-round championship bouts. Now, of course, we know that that championship fight with Glover Teixeira was 28 seconds away from ruining that narrative I just talked about, but Jiri made sure to spoil that narrative and get the submission with just 28 seconds left. And that victory over Glover is what allowed Jiri to become the light heavyweight champion. Then we know that he would go on to begin his rivalry with Alex Pereira, losing in November of 2023, winning against Alexander Rakic, and then losing again to Pereira in June of last year. But since the second loss to Alex, he has now won back-to-back fights, both in 2025, both by third-round knockout, and both against elite-level light heavyweights. Khalil Rountree Jr. here, and at UFC 311 in January, a knockout over former champion Jamal Hill. And so you could argue that in any other weight class, this would be enough to earn a championship opportunity for Jiri. However, the problem for him is that he is 0-2 against Alex Pereira, both of them by way of knockout, and both of them coming in the last 2 years. And pair that narrative with the fact that Carlos Ulberg improved his win streak to 9 in a row last weekend in the main event of UFC Perth by getting a vicious knockout against Dominic Reyes. Also includes wins over Jan Blachowicz and Volkan Oezdemir, and also segueing that second point into the third point of Carlos Ulberg being a fresh addition to the title discussion for light heavyweight, and that a bout between him and Alex Pereira would be a fresh matchup that we have not yet seen. In my personal opinion, I would give the nod to Carlos Ulberg and make him the #1 contender for Pereira's throne, and I'm not saying that Jiri has to go off and fight someone else. I think that he could simply just wait and see what happens between those two. However, if you already tuned into the title fight recap, then you know that the scenario I'm about to present plays a major factor in the future of both Jiri and Carlos Ulberg, and that is this. I think that Alex Pereira has his eyes set on moving to the heavyweight division and fighting the winner of the Cyril Gane and Tom Aspinall bout 3 weeks after UFC 320 at UFC 321. And that can even be backed up by the fact that Alex Pereira met with Dana White in the Performance Institute on Saturday, the day of his championship bout at UFC 320, and told him that he has interest in moving to heavyweight following this bout with Ankalaev. And so if that is true, and that is what Pereira decides to do, and the UFC allows him to do so, moving to heavyweight to finish off his career, then I think that you can simply pair up Jiri Prochazka and Carlos Ulberg for the vacant light heavyweight championship, and it's a fresh matchup between the two as well. That way Jiri doesn't have to fight Pereira for a third time, a fight that no one is necessarily clamoring for, even though we're not going to bat an eye if the UFC decided to go that route because we know it would deliver. And Carlos Ulberg would be awarded his opportunity UFC at UFC Gold after winning 9 fights in a row and capping it off with a vicious knockout over Dominic Reyes. But let me know down in the comments below if you think that is what's going to happen, which would then inevitably leave the vacated title up for grabs between Jiri Prochazka and Carlos Ulberg, the two clear-cut #1 contenders at 205. The 29-year-old 9th-ranked featherweight in the world, Youssef Zalal, his story is second to none. And that is because in his first stint in the UFC, which featured 7 bouts, he would win his first 3, then he would go on to lose 3 in a row and cap out his first stint in the company with a draw, which would ultimately lead to him getting released from the organization. But he did not let that deter him, because he would go on to the regional scene and secure 3 stoppage victories, which would then lead the UFC to come calling and bring him back for a second run in the company, and he has made good on that second opportunity by going 5-0 since re-debuting last March. And the win streak in the UFC includes submissions over Billy Quarantillo and Jack Shore, a decision win over top 15 ranked Calvin Kattar, and now at UFC 320, a first round submission over Josh Emmett, the former interim title challenger and 8th ranked featherweight in the world. And Youssef Zalal made it look easy, chopped through Emmett like a hot knife through butter in just 1 minute and 38 seconds. And I think that this victory over Emmett potentially put the Moroccan Devil Youssef Zalal in the category of title contender, and just maybe one more win away from getting a crack at the featherweight title. So in my opinion, in the aftermath of this bout, with this amazing performance, dare I say star-making performance from Youssef Zalal, this is how I would move forward with the featherweight division to finish 2025 and begin 2026. In December, on the final pay-per-view in UFC history and of 2025, UFC 323 on December 6th, I would do Volkanovski versus Lerone Murphy for the championship, in what will be Volkanovski's first title defense of his second reign, and Lerone Murphy's opportunity to capture gold and remain perfect as a professional mixed martial artist. Then we have Movsar Evloev, who is also undefeated, waiting in the wings, and I personally feel that he should not have to fight anyone else in order to fight for the championship, but I'm also not confident in the UFC just allowing him to sit and wait for the winner of Volkanovski versus Murphy either. So I think there are 2 options you could do with Movsar. You could run back the rematch with Diego Lopez, or you could have him fight a fresh matchup with Yair Rodriguez. But in my ideal scenario, let's just assume that Movsar doesn't have to fight and he gets the winner of Volkanovski versus Murphy. Then we can finally get the fight between Diego Lopez and Yair Rodriguez, which would then leave Youssef Zalal to take on former bantamweight champion turned featherweight title hopeful Aljamain Sterling. But do you agree with my matchmaking for the 145-pound division and title contention discussion? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. And if you don't agree, let me know what you would do differently from a matchmaking perspective as well. Body Bags Joe Pyfer kicked off the UFC 320 main card with a second-round submission over Abus Magomedov that improved his win streak to 3 in a row since suffering the loss to Jack Hermansson. And I think that it's pretty clear that with time and more fights under Pyfer's belt, that fight against Jack Hermansson was just way too much too soon for his career, especially his young UFC tenure, because that was a main event opportunity against a top 15 middleweight after just 3 UFC bouts. But now, after this second 3-fight win streak for Pyfer that includes Marc-Andre Barriault, Kelvin Gastelum, and Abus Magomedov, with 2 of the 3 by way of stoppage, I think it's time for him to get another opportunity at the top 15 of 185. And I think a perfect next matchup for Joe Pyfer would be the 12th ranked Roman Dolidze, who's been a perennially ranked top 15 middleweight fighter for years at this point, and will be looking to regain some momentum after suffering a loss to Anthony Fluffy Hernandez earlier this summer. The prelim headliner was the middleweight Francis Ngannou himself, Ateba Gautier, out of Cameroon, who continues to solidify himself as probably the most terrifying fighter in the middleweight division, and maybe even in the entire damn UFC itself. Because at 23 years young, he is already 9-1 as a professional, and 8 of his 9 victories come by way of knockout, with 7 of the 8 coming in the very first round, and that includes this one here at UFC 320 against the UFC short notice newcomer Treston Vines. And oh, I feel so bad for Treston, but my hat is off to you, my friend, for debuting and taking on this big challenge on short notice. And I think that will lead to him getting a second opportunity to remain in the UFC after saving saving this prelim headliner, but the night belonged to Atiba Gautier, who is absolutely chiseled out of stone, built like a Greek god, and fights with absolute brutalizing power on the feet. He's a 2024 Dana White Contender Series alum and is now 3-0 in the UFC and has not lost a fight since July of 2022, where he lost a very close split decision. And at this young of age, and considering that he fought someone brand new to the UFC, I'm not saying that we need to launch him into a top 15 matchup in the middleweight division next. No, quite the opposite. I think that he should have at least 2 more fights minimum before facing top 15 opposition, because I believe that Atiba Gautier could be a potential star for the UFC and for this 185-pound weight class. The 30-year-old Willie Cat out of Brazil, Daniel Santos, improved to 14-2 as a professional, and he did so by taking out Zombie Jr. via second-round knockout just 21 seconds in. And that marked 4 consecutive victories in a row for Santos after suffering defeat in his UFC debut in April of 2022. So now building up quite an impressive resume, finishing 2 of those 4 victories. I think he's right on the cusp of getting a top 15 opposition in this featherweight division. As much as I didn't want to talk about this fight from a what happened in the octagon perspective, I can't discuss UFC 320 without at least mentioning the fact that Patchy Mix is now 0-2 in the UFC, one of the most highly touted free agent signings in recent memory for the Ultimate Fighting Championship, who was a former dominant Bellator champion with big-time victories against their top-level opposition. Since moving to the UFC, has lost both of his bouts, one being a top 10 opponent in Mario Bautista, and now a UFC debutant KSW alum Jacob Wicklax. However, it is worth noting that it was a very close split decision, and dare I say a controversial decision at that even left 77% of the verbal sparring community on X siding with Patchy Mix, having thought he did enough to get the nod on the scorecards, but for the judges, he didn't. So let me know down in the comments below 2 things. 1, did you think Patchy Mix did enough to get the victory, and was this a, dare I say, robbery? And 2, what does being 0-2 in the UFC mean for Patchy Mix moving forward? Because I said as much on Friday that if he went in here and lost, it was essentially already the end of his UFC run, even if he actually has another fight. Because I think now he is not even sniffing top 15 territory and far, far away from title contention. Edmund Shabazian continues to improve his skill sets, and at 27 years of age is having his second coming in the UFC after securing another first-round stoppage, this time with 2 seconds to go in the opening round, getting a knockout against Andre Muniz. Edmund has now won 4 of his last 5, including 3 in a row, and as I said, is just 27 years old, even though he's been in the UFC since November of 2018. And we know that he was thrust into a main event opportunity with Derek Brunson far too soon, kind of similar to how Joe Pyfer was thrown in too soon with Jack Hermanson. And that loss to Brunson started a very rough stretch of things for Edmund. That would include a stretch of 5 fights where he would lose 4 of them. However, since then, as I just mentioned, he's won 4 of his last 5, so he has essentially turned the tide in his career. He's having a second coming, a resurgence for himself, and I think he's 1 win away from challenging a ranked fighter once again. The 35-year-old former featherweight title challenger Yana Santos has now won 3 consecutive bouts at women's bantamweight, and this now includes the number 5 ranked Macy Chiasson after Yana looked incredible over the course of this 15-minute unanimous decision win. And while yes, the 3rd round did belong to Macy in relatively dominant fashion, Yana Santos looked better than we have ever seen her before in rounds 1 and 2, and she had a chip on her shoulder after Macy missed weight on Friday. So now Yana holds wins over a top 5 ranked opponent and a former champion in Misha Tate. Come Tuesday morning will potentially be the 5th ranked bantamweight in the world, and I think is now just 1 more win away from getting a second crack at UFC Gold, this time at 135 as compared to 145 to start her UFC career years ago. And believe it or not, as I talked about on Friday, the women's bantamweight division actually has a lot of momentum going for it right now. Kayla Harrison is the new champion. Yana Santos, number 10, just fought the 5th ranked Macy Chiasson here. Ketlin Vieira and Norma Dumont are facing off, I believe, at the beginning of November, which is number 3 versus number 4. The 7th ranked Eileen Perez is surging right now. The 11th ranked Jacqueline Cavalcanti is one of the more underrated fighters in all of the UFC in terms of a ranked fighter perspective. And Jocelyn Edwards, who sits at number 14, is having herself a career resurgence. So I think that you could pair up Yana Santos with Juliana Pena, the former champion, or Raquel Pennington, the former champion, either of them, and if Yana can go in and beat one of those 2 women, she will be a title contender at bantamweight. And last but not least, Ramiz Brahimaj made another statement in his victory over Austin Vanderford in the second fight of the night on the UFC 320 prelims, as he damaged Austin Vanderford brutally on the feet with a nasty head kick and finished it with a second round guillotine choke submission, improving his record to 13-5 and keeping his 100% finish rate intact. 13 wins, 13 finishes, 12 submissions, and 1 knockout. And that's now 3 wins in a row for Brahimaj, and if he can keep this going, a 100% finish rate, he won't need many more victories before he's getting a top 15 opponent. So that is it for the UFC 320 recap, and I want to get all of your thoughts on this card down in the comments below. What were your biggest takeaways, and what do you think is next for the big time performers? If you enjoyed this recap, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, because we are on the road to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and the goal is to hit that mark by the end of 2025, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. You can also join the discussion on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok. You can like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where every Monday and Friday podcast episodes release there. Have a great week, and I will see you all in the next video.